Thanks very much, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Penny Whiteheart, a senior consultant with Creative Economic Development Consulting, headquartered in beautiful downtown Elkin, North Carolina. And I'm really excited to welcome all of you here this afternoon for our workshop on funding resources. We have about 50 economic developers on the webinar today, and I bet all of you are working to improve the economic development environment in your community, whether it's a town or a county or region or even the whole state. And I bet you all have brilliant strategies laid out to address your goals, but I bet that all of your strategies are somehow constrained by resources. And on the other hand, we have public agencies and officials with policy goals and funding streams. And you may read headlines or hear another town or region excited about a new grant they secured to advance a transformational idea. And as an economic developer, I would read about these accounts and I would try to understand why that initiative was worthy of funding and what did that project or county do to pull the string on some magic funding piñata. Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain, so to speak, and try to demystify some of the funding sources for economic development in North Carolina. But first, I want to draw your attention to the names and logos that we're going to scroll across the screen now. These are the companies and organizations that are NCEDA annual sponsors. And this program wouldn't be possible without their generous contributions to help all of us in our economic development efforts. And in fact, there wouldn't really be much about NCEDA without these sponsors. So we thank them for what they do on behalf of North Carolina's economic development. Now, since you've decided to spend your lunch hour with us, you know that NCEDA has assembled a distinguished panel of 5 public servants who are eager to share their funding sources with economic development organizations. And all of these guests have money, and their goal is to match it to worthy and impactful projects with some caveats. And our program today will explore and illuminate the criteria, guidelines, funding cycles, relevant state, federal laws, even tax laws that are required for this magic funding piñata that you're going to have access to. Now, our session is being recorded and all the slides will be available to you, but my advice for the best takeaway is for you to reach out and get to know these folks and their agencies and to help them understand the strategies and resources that your community is advancing. So let's meet our panelists, and we'll start with our federal partners. Bruce Pleasant is Director of Business and Cooperative Programs at USDA, that's U.S. Department of Agriculture, Rural Development. And he and his team of specialists administer business loans and grants, and they drive job creation primarily in rural North Carolina communities. And Bruce has 26 years of experience at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Next, my good friend Hillary Sherman, who's North Carolina's representative for the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration. And she works with communities all across the state to implement specific economic development programs. She previously worked at USEDA in Washington, D.C. She's now affiliated with their Atlanta office, but is full-time advancing economic development programs in North Carolina. Next up is Olivia Collier, whose funding programs is really a state and federal partnership. The Appalachian Regional Commission, or ARC, is a program managed inside the North Carolina Department of Commerce. ARC's awarded $81 million to more than 453 projects in North Carolina, and in turn leveraging $136 million more dollars for funding and creating and retaining thousands of jobs here. David Spratley, I'm sure, is known to all of you, and we should pause and thank him for his recent service as Acting Secretary of Commerce. Thanks very much. Since 2019, he's been Senior Assistant Secretary of Finance at the Department of Commerce. and he leads two important units that you'll be hearing about: the Rural Economic Development Division and the Commerce Finance Center. Of course, you all know that David, prior to that, was Vice President of Business Recruitment at the EDP-NC and has worked for a long time, probably with all of us, advancing economic development in North Carolina. And last but certainly not least, Ted Lord from the Golden Leaf Foundation, where he's been since 2005. He serves as Senior Vice President and Counsel. And I'm sure you all know that Golden Leaf is a private foundation, which was established in North Carolina in 1999 through the proceeds of our Tobacco Settlement Master Agreement. Prior to Golden Leaf, Ted worked at the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation nearby in Winston-Salem. So we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn. I want to remind you that if you'll enter your questions in the chat, we'll have some time at the end of the program to ask questions of each of them or all of them together. And if you will stay muted, that'll make maybe the program go smoother. And so we'll kick it off again with Bruce Pleasant of USEDA.
Right. Thank you. I'm going to be sharing with you a satellite view of 6 of our more than dozen programs that we administer under business and cooperative programs within the mission area of rural development under the Department of Agriculture. So we'll start with the Business and Industry Guaranteed program, and this is our flagship program. By far, it's the largest in terms of dollars that we administer. It is to provide loan guarantees to assist businesses either start up or expand in rural areas, and to assist lenders in providing favorable rates or terms that would otherwise not be available without the guarantee. It is not intended for marginal or substandard loans, but as a credit enhancement. Next slide, please. And just to give you an idea as to the impact of this program, in last year, we funded 24 loans, and that should read $101 million in obligations with an average loan size of 4.2 million. And this is an example. I've got lots of photographs in these slides, basically for examples of some of the projects that we have actually completed in North Carolina. And this is an RV park and campground, I believe, near at the Asheboro Zoo. And I would like to just remind everyone that the eligible lenders can either be regulated banks and credit unions, and we even have some non-regulated lenders that may qualify. So there are a lot of lenders that are eligible to participate in this program. And any borrower, any legal entity can be an eligible borrower for the Business and Industry Guaranteed Program, including individuals and sole proprietors. The borrower must be engaged in some type of business enterprise. And this is an example of one of the type of borrowers that have benefited from our program. There's a company, one of the oldest corporations in North Carolina, the North Carolina Granite Corporation, which makes monuments such as like the ones for this World War II memorial in Washington, D.C. And they also provide a lot of curbing for, for in that town, as well as a lot of others in the northeastern part of the country. And projects must be located in a rural area, and we define that as any town other than an area that has a population greater than 50,000 and the contiguous or adjacent urbanized areas. There is a rural area mapping tool that can be found at the address at that site, which will help you identify eligible and ineligible areas. This photo is an example of an oyster company that has that harvests oysters and sells oysters to restaurants, and that's another example of a project that has utilized the Business and Industry Guaranteed Program. And I put this slide in just to show that Not all projects have to be in a rural area. For instance, projects that distribute or aggregate regionally or locally grown food products can be in urban areas as well as rural areas. And that would include a lot of food co-ops. And some other examples of loan purposes could include business acquisitions like real estate purchases and improvements, machinery and equipment, working capital, debt refinancing. These are two examples, a winery and a marina that is located in Western North Carolina that was funded through the Guaranteed program as well. Our loan limits generally up to $25 million to one borrower. And this is another example of a hotel in Beaufort that we used, that we assisted under the B&I Guarantee program. I'm going to transition to the Rural Energy for America program, or REAP. This is open to ag producers and rural small businesses, and it provides grants as well as guaranteed loan assistance for renewable energy systems and energy efficiency improvements. This is an example of a lighting project that was the beneficiary of a grant under that program. And this will give you an idea as to the impact. Last year, we obligated nearly $140 million in 27 loans with an average loan size of $5.2 million, predominantly for solar arrays like the one pictured. And we do also have some other technologies in our energy portfolio, which includes biogas as well. And you can see, going back to the previous slide, the biogas facility utilizes, in that case, swine waste. The Value Added Producer Grant Program is a competitive grant that utilizes value-added ag products. In this case, sweet potatoes to vodka and processed meats, and that is actually a cycle that's open now. And eligible applicants can be a variety of agricultural producers or agricultural producer groups. These two photos are some recipients of that particular grant program. The Rural Business Development Grant is real popular with towns. We have funded projects anywhere from streetscape projects to equipment for business incubators to technical assistance type projects to assist small and emerging businesses. This is an example of a farmer's market that we assisted in Elizabethtown. And this will just list some of the eligible areas. And this is another example of an older theater. I think that may have been in Wadesboro that we assisted many years ago to assist a business there. And lastly, the Rural Economic Development Loan and Grant Program is available to electric cooperatives who are RUS borrowers. They obtain loans through the Rural Utilities Service. And these funds can be used for community and economic development projects and to assist with business expansions, as well as local fire rescue type projects, and this would be through a rural electric cooperative. And the assistance is either in the form of a loan, which we consider a pass-through loan. In this case, this was for a school. The initial recipient of this loan is eligible for a 0% interest loan for up to 10 years. And then on the next slide, the last slide, the grants components of that are used to establish a revolving loan fund from which funds are then used to capitalize a revolving loan fund to loan to eligible ultimate recipients. It could be businesses or it could be towns that are needing to use the assistance for community and economic development purposes. And then once the grant is, once the loan initially is repaid, the funds are available to then be reloaned to other projects within the community. And with that, I just thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Next slide, please. I'm Hillary Sherman with EDA, and I'm looking forward to the chance to kind of share a little bit about EDA's grant programs. I'm going to be fairly high level. You can go on to the next slide, please. And start with a summary of what EDA is. We are a federal agency, a small federal agency within the U.S. Department of Commerce that is focused on economic development. As many of you know, economic development is pretty broad and encompasses increasingly so many components. So for us, economic development is really defined as job creation, job retention, and private investment. So when you're thinking about the role of EDA, at the end of the day, it's about facilitating projects, either construction or non-construction, and providing the ecosystem by which private sector businesses can grow and can flourish. We do that three primary ways. We do grants, which is what everybody's most interested in usually, but we also do provide a lot of free data. And so that's one of the things I don't get to talk enough about, but it may be interested to you as economic developers. And I don't have a lot of slides on that today, but if you're interested, please ping me at the end of this and would love to kind of dive into that. We have a lot of occupational and industry cluster data that you can access to help inform local decision-making. And finally, the last kind of primary objective of our agency is really to facilitate regional planning. And we see regional planning as key increasingly with economic development to facilitating good decisions. And we see the value proposition of bringing public and private partners together across local jurisdictional boundaries to really look at what the assets and challenges of a community are, and to think about what the opportunities to move a region forward are. Next slide, please. We have a range of programs by which we do this, and I always tell folks think in terms of buckets because there's just it's a lot to remember. So I think in terms of takeaway, we can fund construction, either new construction or renovation, or we can fund non-construction, and that could include planning, it could include technical assistance, and it could include revolving loan fund capitalization or new funds. So just a kind of a quick example of what that can mean. It can mean water and sewer lines. It can mean floodgates. It could mean things like funding people. And for example, we funded North Carolina Restaurant and Lodging Association. We're funding people to help support recovery from impacts in those establishments from the coronavirus. It can be stormwater. It can be any publicly owned infrastructure that's going to have some kind of link to job creation or job retention. Next slide, please. For most of our programs, the eligible applicant is going to be, next slide, or next thing, is going to be a public entity. So it's going to be the state, it's going to be a locality, a city, a county, a public subdivision. It can be an airport authority. It can be a water sewer authority. It can be a council of government. It can be a tribal organization, or it can be a nonprofit, 501c3, if that nonprofit, and only if that nonprofit is working in collaboration with a unit of local government. Next slide, please. If you meet EDA distress criteria, then you're able to apply. Right now, there's three primary ways, basically unemployment rate, per capita income, or special need. Everybody should be aware that there's basically two things that are really important for economic developers to know in terms of special need. Every designated opportunity zone has been made a eligibility criteria. So those areas are now eligible for EDA criteria, regardless of unemployment rate or per capita income in those areas. And then every jurisdiction that has a presidentially declared disaster area is eligible to claim special need, as long as they can make the case of adverse impact as a result of that presidential disaster declaration and how the project will support recovery. And that could be from Hurricane Matthew, it could be from Florence, it could be from Michael, or it could be from COVID. So basically, because every county right now has a COVID designation, every county is eligible. So for those of you who may have said, oh, I'm staying at a higher per capita income, I can't apply, that may not be true right now. Next slide, please. In order to apply, you have to meet matching share requirements, and that's where really the value these kind of conversations are so important. There's a lot of opportunities to think about leveraging across funding sources. The big thing is the funding has to be for the exact same scope. So if you were going to go to Commerce and apply through the IDF fund, for example, for a water line and come to EDA and play for a sewer line, it's not the same scope. It's got to be for the exact same scope. So it's really important to kind of have those conversations with funders up front and be clear about what you need so that can be discussed and that the matching share hopefully can be best lined up. The big thing is federal sources generally cannot match federal sources unless they're loan, but federal grant sources are problematic. With the exception of CDBG that are non-entitlement, meaning they come through the state, can be matched with EDA dollars, and ARC dollars. My friend Olivia on the webinar and I can kind of co-invest up to 80% of a project cost. So that's something kind of interesting there. On number 4, you can go on next slide. In order to submit, you do have to submit via grants.gov, and you do have to have a complete application package. You can go ahead. Go ahead. And those are what I would call kind of the minimum requirements. In order to be competitive, in order to really have a good chance at coming in, it's really important to know that you have to have additional items. Our funding is not allocated to the state, it's allocated to the regional office, which sits in Atlanta. And there's 8 states that are ultimately having applicants compete for the funding resources. So you basically need to come in and define what your need is. Tell us why are you facing an economic challenge, or what is a problem that you want to solve? Go ahead. Then you really want to tell us how is it a public entity, or what's a public kind of good on this. We're ultimately facilitating investments in publicly owned assets that will help facilitate the ecosystem by which private sector businesses can grow. So that's important for us to be aware of. Next thing. And we want to know how it's going to support job creation or job retention. So if you're coming to us looking for a town administration building, it's probably going to be more difficult to make a linkage to job creation than if you're coming to us for a project like a floodgate in the town of Lumberton, which we just awarded, which is helping support and mitigate risk to businesses for future flooding. For non-construction projects, often it's difficult to make a one-to-one connection to job creation, but you need to tell us who the audience is and what are you going to do with that information so that we really have a clarity that the information is going to be able to be used and not sit in a shelf somewhere. Go ahead. We want to see that the project aligns with the CEDS. Again, if I'm trying to look at the opportunity to link to and build on regional assets, go ahead. And that it aligns with at least one of EDA's investment priorities. I always tell folks these are sprinkles on a cupcake. These are really great to have, but these by themselves are not going to make a grant competitive. So right now, these are going to include things like recovery and resilience, critical infrastructure, workforce development and manufacturing, exporting and foreign direct investment, or projects that are supporting opportunity zones. If you have a project that does that and doesn't support job creation, is not publicly owned, this is not going to make it competitive. So it needs to have all of these things. And last one, please. And then it's got to meet the technical requirements and be an eligible applicant, have a complete application, have the matching share, all those kind of key pieces. Next slide. This is the 30,000-foot view. In addition to this, we often have additional funding opportunities. One that you may be interested about is the Build to Scale Challenge, which was recently announced. The grant deadline for that is April 29th. And this is really about building the ecosystem to really support scalable companies and facilitate that. So happy to kind of answer any further questions. And thank you, Penny, and thanks for the chance to be here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Olivia Collier. I manage the state's Appalachian Regional Commission program, and I'm happy to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to apologize in advance. My neighbor has decided to weed whack as soon as I've unmuted, so I apologize if it gets really loud. Next slide, please. So the Appalachian Regional Commission, as was alluded to in the opening remarks, is a federal, state, and local government partnership that was created in the mid-1960s. And on this slide, you'll see the footprint. We do stretch from northern Mississippi to southern New York, and we encompass 29 counties in western North Carolina. ARC's mission is to make Appalachia a region of great opportunity that will achieve socioeconomic parity with the nation. And the way that we do this is we innovate, we partner, and we build community capacity to strengthen the region. And as Hillary mentioned, most folks think of us as a funding entity as well, which we are, but we also provide a lot of technical assistance. I have 2 planners that are in the region, and we also work hand in hand with the Council of Governments that serve Western North Carolina. And we also, as Hillary mentioned, we have a wealth of research and data that can help you all make the case for the projects that are needed in your region. Next slide, please. Now, most of you that are not in any of these counties identified on this map, and again, there are 29 in Western North Carolina. We start in Winston-Salem and go west. I do want to make you aware that there is a sister agency to ARC that is authorized, and I saw that Congressman Mac McIntyre was on this call. In 2008 and the 2008 Farm Bill, he and several of his colleagues were able to get the Southeast Crescent Regional Commission authorized. It has been authorized, but has not had a presidential appointee appointed to date. There is some strong movement to do that under the Biden administration. If that were to occur and congressional members would continue to appropriate funding, there would be a sister agency that would cover a huge portion of Virginia, the rest of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all of Florida, the rest of Alabama and Mississippi. So for those of you that are not in Western North Carolina, I thought you might be interested in that. And this may bring up some questions that you have about an ARC in the East, what it would look like. This map shows you how ARC identifies our county economic status. And this is very similar to the state's tier system, not the same, but similar. This does change every October when the federal fiscal year starts. And this is how we determine at ARC the counties that we're really going to focus on and the match rate. So for the counties on this map that are red, and most of West Virginia and Kentucky are on this map as red, those are distressed counties. Those counties are in the top 10% most economically distressed counties in the country. We currently do not have a distressed county in North Carolina, but I imagine the next couple of years when the COVID data catches up to our what we're using, we will have some red counties. I thought this map would be interesting for you all to see. Next slide, please. Now, the way we work at ARC and the way we make investments is ARC has 5 goals: job creation, job retention, workforce development. And workforce development for us encompasses everything from STEAM and STEM education, traditional workforce development with community college and university partners. And we do a lot of healthcare under our workforce development. And so that's our goal number 2. Our goal 3 is critical infrastructure. So we do a lot of water, sewer, broadband, access roads. Our 4th goal is to help communities enhance their natural and cultural assets as economic engines. And our 5th goal is leadership and capacity building. Now, those 5 goals then have to tie into the governor's priorities. And on this slide, you'll kind of see where Governor Cooper has put his priorities. We all are focused on this call on job retention and job creation. We're all focused on expanding and enhancing workforce development. Again, I mentioned STEAM and STEM education. That is a focus of Governor Cooper's. And then again, we're focused on improving the quality of healthcare and healthcare access. And we've done a lot of work in the last couple of years around substance use disorder and how communities are navigating that and how that bleeds into our workforce development challenge. And finally, as I mentioned, broadband. We are doing a lot of work around broadband deployment when we're able to do that. We don't have a lot of funding for broadband, but the little bit we do have, we are trying to help get some businesses connected. We do a lot of work in small towns with downtown Wi-Fi to allow school kids and visitors to have some additional internet connectivity. Next slide, please. I thought it would be good to give you all a snapshot because I know most of you on this call are not familiar with ARC, so that you would see where we invested for the last federal fiscal year. So for the last fiscal year, we funded 42 projects for $14.4 million, which leveraged $122.8 in other investments. Those projects will result in over 1,200 jobs being created or retained and an additional 2,100 students and workers trained. On average in North Carolina, we probably get access, depending on some congressionally designated programs, to 10 million, maybe up to 15 million, as you'll see on the slide, in funding. And so for that amount of money, we do have quite a bit of an impact and are able to leverage a lot of other funds from other sources. Next slide, please. This happens to be a big week for our program. We launched our 2022 program Monday. We accept applications, and my other two federal partners will shake their heads at me because they can't do this. We accept applications for the upcoming federal year before the federal budget is even passed. This allows us to have a pipeline of projects ready to go by October 1st. So our pre-application packet went online on Monday, and I'll post that in the chat in a second. Those pre-apps are due on April 21st, and then folks will be notified around May 17th if they're invited to submit a full application. We do require folks that are invited to submit a full application to attend a required application workshop. Unfortunately, this year, I think that workshop will still be virtual, but that will be held in mid-June. And then full applications are due at the end of July. And then one unique thing about ARC, as I mentioned, it's a partnership. And so when projects come to me and my team, we review those, and then we make recommendations to the governor. And the governor will either say yes or no to those recommendations. The ones that he says yes to will be sent to Washington. The governor does not have approval authority for ARC grants. So what happens is once they get to Washington, there's a whole nother team at the commission that reviews the projects, asks questions, and then they make recommendations to the federal co-chair. That co-chair currently is Tim Thomas. He is a Trump holdover. We're waiting to see who his replacement will be. But currently Tim is the approver of projects. And so I always like to make folks aware when they get an email from me late August, early September that says, congratulations, the governor has recommended your project. That is really the beginning of the application process because it still has to go through a few more layers before it can be approved. And getting the governor's recommendation does not always guarantee approval. We try to work really hard to get to a yes at ARC, but sometimes we're not successful. So I wanted to make sure you all heard that and understood that before you thought about an ARC project. Next slide, please. And this is my contact information. I'm based in Raleigh and I do have a team in the West. So if there are folks that have questions on the ground, I have some staff that I can connect you with to make sure that we get your questions answered. And when we move on to David, he's going to talk about some of my colleagues in the Rural Development Division. I will post the link to our application and I look forward to talking to you all more in depth in the small breakout sessions. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. I'll just jump right in. Not much time, but I'm at a bit of an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time with this group in that many of you know our programs fairly well. Some of you may not be familiar with them. So what I'll try and do is just give a couple of key points to allow you, those who don't know the programs, to be introduced to them, and those that do, to refresh themselves on the kind of the key differences between some of these programs as you're thinking about them as it relates to project work you'll do. I'm only going to be presenting on programs that are traditional project related programs, the ones you're most familiar with. I mention that because I think it's important for everybody to understand that we do have, I know, a dozen or so other programs. Not all of them are grant programs to support economic development efforts, workforce related programs, on-the-job training, incumbent worker training, WOTC credits, also some one-off programs like Site Infrastructure Development Fund, JMAC, film grants, and others. But I'm going to stick to the traditional programs that most economic development practitioners are familiar with and will use the most often. So kind of some of the key elements for these programs that's important for everybody to keep in mind is, with one exception, our programs or grants are made to units of local government. Oftentimes, those funds can be passed through to a business, but the grantees in all our cases, with the exception of JDIG, is the unit of local government applicant. Eligibility and funding levels are very tier dependent. For folks that aren't familiar with the tier system, 100 counties in North Carolina, tiered based on economic well-being, tier 1, the most distressed, tier 3, the least. Many of the programs are not eligible to all tiers, and even if they are, funding levels vary sometimes substantially. Then finally, everybody keep in mind that our priority as it relates to grant programs is job creation and quality job creation. And I'll stress that in a second. Investment's important, but not as important to us as it is at the local level. So jobs drive our programs. Quality jobs means a couple things, but specifically wage levels and health insurance are the two main things that we look for there. So most of our programs require a wage standard that's typically equal to the county wage, and that the employer provides health insurance benefits to their employees. And of course, I'm going to get calls in the middle of this the whole way out. So what I'm going to do is I threw these programs into 3 buckets, and I'll go through them very quickly and point out a couple of key differences. Obviously, public infrastructure programs to fund the things that you see listed there. And those are really in order of what we see most often. Sewer is the most common request, water, all the way down to natural gas and electricity, which is a bit more challenging for us to do. As Olivia mentioned, there are kind of 2 working divisions within Department of Commerce, and I think Penny as well. There is the Commerce Finance Center, and basically the Commerce Finance Center administers the cash grants, JDIG and 1NC. The Rural Division administers the economic infrastructure programs and the building improvement programs that we'll discuss. So it's pretty important that you understand the difference there. Also, there is a Rural Infrastructure Authority, a large committee board that oversees those programs and ultimately makes the award of all those grants that are underneath the Rural Division's administrative staff. Okay. Then we'll go into the 2 building improvement programs, which seem to be everybody's favorite programs these days, and then the cash grants being JDIG and 1NC. Next. All right, we'll start with infrastructure quickly. This is the Rural Economic Infrastructure Program. I'm going to highlight the same types of things for each program so you can see some differences. This is available in tiers 1, 2, and 3, and in tiers 1 and 2, and in rural census tracts in tier 3. I'm also going to be talking about maximum awards and funding levels for each of these programs. Please, please, please do not interpret that to mean that you get the maximum for every project. There's a fair amount of discretion that goes along with this as it relates to our administrative staff and ultimately decision makers, the Rural Infrastructure Authority. So for this program, maximum is 5 to 12.5 per job, capped at $500,000 max in tier 1 and 2, 250 in tier 3. It's based on jobs created over the first 2 years of the grant with a 5% local match. Again, I highlight the RIA approval and award to point out to you that that board oversees this program. Next. Utility account. This one has been around for quite some time. This is actually technically an account that sits underneath the Industrial Development Fund. The Industrial Development Fund was a program that is still on the books, but it hasn't been funded in a decade and a half. And that's because the sub-account called the utility account is funded through proceeds from the Job Development Investment Grant that we'll talk about in a minute, and therefore does not require an appropriation from the General Assembly. So they simply quit appropriating money into the Industrial Development Fund, allow funds to flow into its subsidiary utility account from the JDIG program. This program is only available in tier 1 and 2. It is not available in tier 3 rural census tracts. 5 to 10,000 per job, again, a $500,000 max. I'll pause there and point out that we don't necessarily always do this, but you can receive multiple state grants, infrastructure grants for the same infrastructure project. Or there are times when it's appropriate for us to stack them and allow you to apply for multiple programs, but it's fairly unique. Again, this program contemplates jobs over 2 years with a 5% match. Again, RIA approval. In the one thing that practitioners out there forget all the time, this is the one program that we have that allows us to make grant awards, fund projects where they don't have a bird in hand, where you don't have a company that's willing or ready to commit to creating jobs at that site. We can and have, on a fairly regular basis, done speculative infrastructure support work, primarily around business parks and other kind of key industrial locations that you're trying to develop in your counties or communities. Keep that in mind. Next. CDBG infrastructure. As everybody, I think, probably knows on this, these funds come down through the state in a block grant from HUD. It's available in all tiers. However, it is not available to the entitlement communities that receive their funds directly from HUD. So there's 3 counties and 24 municipalities. They're basically the largest municipalities that don't qualify for this program at the state level. They get their own funds directly. The nice thing about this program is we can fund at much higher levels, maximum award up to 15 per job. Technically, we could go higher than that according to federal rules, capped at $1 million, 750 in tier 3. Again, jobs based on the first 2 years of the grant with a 25% local match for this program. The downside to this program is the federal requirements that go along with it. That can affect, that can almost always do affect cost and timing. I stress costs for CDBG infrastructure. Timing is typically not a problem when we're using CDBG to do infrastructure, public infrastructure. It's usually on the cost side of the equation. And the final thing I'll point out about HUD, or not about HUD, but about CDBG, is the primary objective, at least as it relates to our programs, is job creation for low and moderate income people. So 60% of the jobs that are committed to have to be filled by people that were low and moderate income prior to receiving the job. Therefore, we can't use it for all types of projects. They typically tend to be your traditional manufacturing distribution type projects. Okay. Next. We'll switch gears now. I'm going into the building improvement bucket. There's 2 programs that we have to support improvements to existing buildings. One is through the CDBG program, so no reason to reiterate everything I said. Same rules as it relates to low and moderate income, low LMI, who can receive it. The maximum award is different here. It's up to $20,000 per job, capped at $750,000. The federal strings that I will put here typically can affect costs, but the big issue with this is timing, typically. When you have a company that is looking to expand or locate into either a vacant building or a building that they currently occupy, the timing is often a challenge to use CDBG. If the timing works, you can get twice as much money through this program as our traditional rural building renovation or building reuse program. Next. Moving on to the rural program, this is available in tiers 1, 2, and 3, and 1 and 2 and rural census tracts in tier 3, but as you'll see, the funding levels are much lower. 5 to 12.5 per job, to be quite honest with you, because of limited funding these days. We've been funding anywhere from about $5,000 to $8,000 per job, just as a reality check. Again, jobs over the first 2 years with a 5% local match. Everybody loves this program. Every economic developer out there, I think the first thing they say to any company is, are you expanding? If so, I can get you some money for a building reuse grant. That's great. We're able to affect a lot of positive outcomes across the state, reach every nook and cranny of the state with this program. The problem is we're very limited on funding now. We are running into our April meeting with the RIA to approve our next batch of grants, and that will use up our funds for the rest of the year, the rest of the fiscal year. So we will be out of funds through June 30th. So we've been funding these at a lower level, and quite frankly, we've been trying to push CDBG to projects when it's applicable and doable. Okay. Next. And then finally, our 2 programs that are cash grants. Everybody hears and thinks about these the most, but quite frankly, if you don't have the assets that the other programs fund, infrastructure and a real estate option for a company, you're never going to use these programs anyway, because you won't have a place to put a company. These are, the 1NC is really as simple as cash for jobs program. That's what it is, a grant to the unit of local government who they pass through to the company. As the company creates the jobs, they draw the money down. Typically, the awards are based on tier at a level about equal to 1,000 in tier 3, 2,000 tier 2, 3,000 in tier 1. For the most part, we are not making 1NC awards in tier 3 right now. We have done them in some rural census tracts, but don't be surprised if you're a tier 3 community, if you have a challenge getting a One North Carolina for the project. Okay? This program contemplated jobs over the first 3 years instead of 2. And it is a but-for program, meaning that we have to be competing with a location outside of North Carolina at the time the grant is awarded. And the governor awards this, but passes or delegates that authority for the most part down to the Secretary of Commerce. So this is something that we can do quickly in that it is, the approval goes through the Secretary of Commerce. And then finally, JDIG, the next slide. We could go on for hours and days about the intricacies of this program. It's a very complicated program, but it's a very effective program. Grants are, in essence, based on a percentage of the state income tax withholdings back to the company that are generated by the new jobs that they create around the project. This is the only program where we have a direct grant to the company. The unit of local government is not the applicant. So I mentioned prior, if a project's located in tier 2 or 3 county, a portion of that grant is peeled off and goes to fund the utility account for infrastructure improvements in tier 1 and 2 communities. This contemplates jobs over 5 years. Again, it's a but-for program. The approving authority for this falls within the Economic Investment Committee, EIC, a 5-member board that the Secretary of Commerce chairs. So different approving environment for this program. And as I mentioned, it is a grant directly to the company. Everybody gets all jazzed up over this program, and for good reason. I will say that it's not always the right tool for all projects. Quite frankly, many smaller projects would benefit more from getting building reuse in One North Carolina from a dollar perspective than JDIG. So I'll make that point and move in. I think that wraps up my comments. Oh, and one final thing. Do educate yourself. Take the time to hop in and look at the other programs, even if you know these. Go to the Commerce website. You see listed here to review the incentives. Also, EDPNC has on their website incentives that links back to our website for some of the programs. So take some time to familiarize yourself with all our offerings.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ted Lord with the Golden Leaf Foundation. Thanks very much for being here. And I'm going to run through my presentation quickly so we have time for a couple of questions. I think there have been at least one that's been put in the chat, but please put any other ones in there also. So first of all, I'll give you a little bit of an overview of Golden Leaf if you're not familiar with us. We are a 501c3 charitable foundation that was formed to administer the part of the state settlement with the tobacco companies through their master settlement agreement in 1999. You'll see our mission there is to increase economic opportunity in North Carolina's rural, economically distressed, and tobacco-dependent communities through grant-making, collaboration, innovation, and stewardship as an independent and perpetual foundation. You've seen some maps from some of the other funders today delineating the areas in which they work, and David talked about the tiers. Most of our programs, we have some flexibility in determining where we work. So we define rural, economically distressed, tobacco-dependent a little bit more broadly, and our board takes some discretion when they are thinking about where to implement projects and to fund grants that come to the foundation. The exception being our scholarship programs, where we have some very clearly defined counties that are eligible for participation. So we'll go on to the next slide. In the last year or so, about 6 months really, we've been working through a strategic planning process, and thanks to Crystal Morphus, who's on the call, who with her collaborator Ted Abernathy led us through that process. And our board has established the strategic priorities that you see here on the screen. So to increase job creation and economic investment in our target communities, to improve workforce preparedness, and there we primarily focus on areas, on projects that are implemented through the community college and high schools level and higher to train folks for job opportunities in the communities in which those institutions are located. We obviously are interested very much in the state's agriculture industry, having come out of the settlement with the tobacco manufacturing companies. We want to make sure that our farmers have good opportunities in the state. The board has also expressed some interest in a broader strategy to improve the competitiveness, capacity, and vitality of targeted communities. We're in the process of defining and implementing strategies there, although Recently, we did just announce an award to the School of Government to provide some training to local government leaders in economically distressed areas of the state. And then finally, we are going to be working on some organizational strategies to help improve the effectiveness of Golden Leaf and our own work in the state. So we'll go on to the next slide. Today, for this audience, I'm going to focus on job creation and economic investments. I think that's the priority area that will be of most interest to you. We award grants to units of local government and nonprofit organizations. So you think about counties, cities, a lot of economic development organizations or 501c3 nonprofit organizations, water and sewer districts, and so forth are eligible entities. We have these 3 programs right now. Now, as I mentioned, we just completed our strategic planning process, and our next steps are going to be to implement some of those strategic planning objectives. So these programs may be changing over the next couple of months. I don't think the fundamentals of what we do will be changing, but some of the programs might be adjusted to better accommodate the strategic goals that the board has identified. But the Economic Catalyst Program, this is a program in which we work closely with the Department of Commerce. Typically, this is a program that's designed to address situations where a company is locating or expanding in the state and needs assistance from Golden Leaf to make that location or expansion occur. The awards for this program range and depend largely on the kinds of outcomes associated with the project. The outcomes here are job creation and the quality of those jobs, so looking at wages, benefits, those sorts of things. We are accepting applications for this program throughout the year. And to give you a sense of scale, typically grants in this program range from $3,000 to $7,000 per job, but the board on occasion will go higher or lower depending on the characteristics of a particular project. Our Open Grants program is also available throughout the year. This is a smaller program where we take a variety of applications having to do with everything from workforce preparedness to agriculture to economic development. The grants here are up to $200,000 per project. It's a 2-step application. The first step is a letter of inquiry, which is a form that's available on our webpage. And then if the board's interested in the project, they'll invite a full proposal, and that's then taken up by our board, and they'll consider whether or not to award funding. And again, the cap there is $200,000, so these are typically smaller projects. And then the Community-Based Grants Initiative is a regional program based on prosperity zones. We are right now closing out that program in the Northwestern Prosperity Zone and opening up in the Western Prosperity Zone. So if you're in the West, this would be of interest to you, and reach out to me. I'll give you some more detail on it. But generally speaking, it's a program where we focus on large economic development opportunities and workforce preparedness opportunities by prosperity zone, and we'll award up to $1.5 million per county. So it's different from Open Grants in that the grant awards are much larger, and different from Economic Catalyst in that it's not tied necessarily to a specific job creation opportunity. If we can go on to the next slide, please. This is to give you an idea of the scale of our grant making just in job creation and economic investment. And you'll see it varies pretty widely from year to year. These are calendar year numbers. So we've ranged here from 19.5 roughly funded to only $8 million funded in this area in 2018. Of course, we're making grants for scholarships, workforce preparedness, agriculture, other programs throughout the year also, and those are not reflected in these numbers. The 2021 $200,000, just to put some context around that, our board's had 1 meeting this year, so we expect that number is going to go up pretty significantly here shortly. We've got a lot of projects actually pending for the April grants making. If you'll go on to the next slide. The things that we fund. As I mentioned before, 501c3 and governmental entities are eligible for funding. We allow the funds must be used for charitable purposes, which means you can't use them for what we would define or describe as impermissible private benefits. Think about that as not passing the money through an eligible entity onto a for-profit business. For example, that's one thing that would be impermissible. We don't allow the use of funds to acquire land or to be used for grant administration. In economic development, typically what you're going to see grant funds used for are water and sewer infrastructure, some workforce preparedness associated with particular economic development projects. We have a equipment leasing program that we use for some projects where it's a benefit to a company that's having trouble securing financing elsewhere. Some folks on this call know that that can be a pretty complex program, especially if the company doesn't create the jobs that were anticipated because there's some penalties associated with it, but that is available. Then we have other unique situations that come up where we try to be responsive to within the range of what we're permitted to do with our grant funds. So if you have something creative and different, if it's not listed on our webpage or in this information, give us a call and we'll explore it with you and see whether it's something that we can participate in. course, all of our grants are approved by our board. We have a 15-member board of directors, and then we are, although we're a private foundation or we're a 501c3 charitable foundation, we are subject to audit by the state auditor. We're also a public records organization, so we are in some ways similar to state entities. When we're looking at job creation and economic investment projects, these are the kinds of outcomes that we're typically trying to track. So investment in publicly owned infrastructure, how much going into water, sewer, roads. We can do municipal electrical systems also as part of publicly owned infrastructure. Privately owned property, plant, and equipment. So what's the capital investment associated with the project? How many full-time jobs are being created, and what's the wage of those jobs? We're looking in comparison to county average wage. And then business startups is something else that we're interested in. These other narrative outcomes that we have here, these are things that we also will follow on particular projects, but they're not our top priority outcomes. They're usually things that we'll ask if these are the kinds of things you can track as part of a project that might encourage our board to make a larger award or increase our board's interest in the proposal. If you'll move on to the next slide, please. Just a couple of examples here. In Davidson County, through the Community-Based Grants Initiative, we made a $1 million grant to establish some sewer infrastructure for an industrial park. There was no company that had identified an interest in that park at the time, but it was a high priority for the county, so our board made that investment. And ultimately, in July 2017, Egger Wood Products located there announced a $700 million project and 770 jobs. So that's an example of a project that was made without a client in mind, but that led to that success in Davidson County. And then on the next slide, you'll see in Johnston County, this was an economic development project where a company that is a Ashley Home Store licensee and distributor located, and it's going to create 161 permanent full-time jobs. And we've mentioned this one because it's a good collaboration with EDA on that project. We've worked closely with them to make sure, as Hillary mentioned, that the funding is aligned, that we're splitting the water and sewer costs with EDA so that everybody is able to participate and maximize the funding sources available. If you'll go on to the next slide, please. There's my contact information. I would encourage anyone who needs more information about the foundation, has a question about what we fund, whether what you're interested in is something that we can help with, just reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to speak with you. I spend a lot of my time doing that, and it's something I enjoy doing, and we'll try to share whatever information we can, and I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ted, and all of the panelists. And now we're going to assemble them through the magic of video conferencing and ask them to reply to a couple of questions. First off, there's been a lot of talk about a federal infrastructure funding opportunity. And I wonder if any of you has either intel about that, or if you have some ideas about how that might be approached here in North Carolina. And I'll ask you all, just go ahead and unmute the five of you and jump in if you have a response to how that federal infrastructure might be manifest here in North Carolina.
All right, I guess no one's going to jump in. I will say I am not familiar with kind of the realities around that. And one thing that I will stress is this, is for obvious reasons, and I think long overdue, there's a lot of interest, especially out of the governor's office, as it relates to broadband infrastructure now. And a fair amount of discussion about using federal dollars already allocated to the states for COVID relief to do some of that work. How that will play out between the governor's office and the General Assembly, I don't know. I think there is some common ground there, and that everybody understands, especially in light of what we've gone through for the last year, the need to beef up broadband, high-speed internet access and infrastructure that goes along with that.
Penny, this is Hillary. I would say is, not speaking on behalf of Congress on any action that hasn't yet to be taken. I would just note that there is, a number of agencies that, should the next CARES Act package that's currently being debated in the Senate get passed, that potentially could have additional resources, one of which is EDA. So I think this is one of the just a point of reiteration of how important it is to kind of stay in touch with potential funders, is because it is a moving target, and sometimes it's hard for us to really comment on it until it happens. But we are responsive and really will be eager to explore what that looks like if and when it comes through, and look at how that could align with your individual projects.
Thanks, Hillary, and hopefully NCEDA can be a conduit for that information at the right time. Anybody else have any feedback about the potential for federal infrastructure funding?
I think there is strong potential, particularly after the next CARES Act goes through. I do think they are talking about a larger infrastructure package. Brass tacks will be what actually happens when the two chambers put pen to paper, but it is definitely something for you all to watch.
Well, thanks for that. And I have one more quick question before we transition to the breakout. Some people may be disconnecting as we go over the 2 o'clock hour. But, for a lot of economic development agencies or even small local governments, some of these grant application processes can seem like a very daunting task. And some of you even reflected that in your comments. And so I wonder if you would just take a moment and either reassure folks, give them ideas about the kinds of support or technical assistance that might be available for putting together a grant, or if you have advice about, I know sometimes a grant writer might seem like a panacea to add that kind of resource. So would y'all mind just giving some feedback on assistance with applications?
Yeah, I'll jump in first, just talk about the commerce programs in general. Depends on the program. Some of them are quite straightforward and simple, where you don't need a grant administrator. You need somebody that's just willing to put in a little bit of time with staff to understand what they're doing and fill it out. I will also say that oftentimes units of local government don't use the program staff nearly to the extent that they should, meaning our staff will help you understand not only how to fill it out, but what we're looking for as you fill out the application, kind of the softer grantsmanship aspects of filling out an application. Some of the programs, CDBG comes to mind. It does make sense, especially for smaller communities don't have the resources or the opportunity to have a full-time or even a part-time grant administrator on staff. There are resources out there that can be contracted and oftentimes can be contracted through funds of the program that you're applying for, meaning no money out to the unit of local government. And then quite frankly, the most complicated program we have is JDIG. That is not a local government grant application. I mean, they're not the applicant. Those challenges basically go between the company and Department of Commerce. So, yes, it can be daunting, but if you just take the time to get to know the staff, ask some questions, it can be done by novices.
Depending on the grants for the USDA, some of these programs do not require a grant writer at all. We can assist the applicant in putting together an application. Some others I would suggest at least talking with a grant writer, if not to write the grant, to review the grant, maybe give some ideas that can be valuable, especially with some of our competitive grant programs. And but it varies depending on the program in terms of what type of expertise is needed in order to write. But we do have some stakeholders that actually will assist with the preparation of some of those application packages as well.
From our perspective at Golden Leaf, I think one of the things that we think our job is to help folks apply for the program. So we look at the applications. When we do our due diligence, we try to tease out the information that may be relevant to our review of the project. So first of all, some of the programs are specifically designed to be simple for people to apply in. The letter of inquiry process is structured specifically to allow people to access the foundation without putting a lot of effort into a full proposal. And then our role is to follow up and ask questions and make sure we understand exactly what your goals are and what the outcomes are and whether it's a fit with the foundation. So we just encourage people to put projects forward, and we'll work with you to get the information we need.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, I'm sorry, go ahead, Olivia.
Go ahead.
I was just going to reiterate all those great points that have made. And, I think one of the things I would say to economic developers is don't self-select. If you are taking the time to just dive right into applications, other communities are calling and asking the questions. And so you wouldn't do that with a site selector. So why would you do that with a funder? We are all here and committed. We work really closely together. And having a conversation about what do you want to do? What's your budget? Who owns the project? In a conversational way up front can give you information to know what your competitiveness may be in addition to how do you do this, and can help you figure out the path of least resistance to help you get to yes. And it may not necessarily be the first call. And so I think that's a really important takeaway, hopefully, to make that. And even those of us who do federal grants, and there's a lot of paperwork in that, I think all of us are really committed to trying to make the process as efficient and clear and lucid as it possibly can be, recognizing that there are, a lot of pieces to it, but there are pieces sometimes you can do in a certain order that can make it easier. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the EDA partners with economic development districts across the state who also can be resources, who are often the same as the councils of government, who are partners out there.
I would agree with what they all said.
Well, thanks to all of you all. I want to thank you again, Bruce, Hillary, David, Olivia, Ted, all of you for caring about North Carolina, for taking time this afternoon to spend time with us to help us all be more effective in what we're doing. And before we turn to Liz to set up these breakout sessions, I want to take another minute just to recognize and thank the annual sponsors of NCEDA. We looked at their logos earlier in our program. And again, that's how professional development is supported in our association. And want to take a moment to remind you that the spring conference is coming up, and you can go back to your inbox to find the registration materials there. It's March 17th. And we'll be hearing from new Commerce Secretary Michelle Sanders. So I hope you'll all make plans to be there on March 17th. I especially want to thank Emily, the technical manager of this webinar, keeping us all moving through our paces, to Lawrence and Liz for the strategy and ideas behind the program today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Liz, and she's going to move us into the breakout sessions where you can begin that relationship building with these funding partners. Thank you all.